So Don Charles, or should I say Daniel Dubois has left Don Charles. So Daniel Dubois has left Don Charles. And I think it's important to discuss what this means. And to me, the first thing I want to address is, what was Don Charles's contribution to Daniel Dubois? Because if you look at it, initially when Don Charles took on Daniel Dubois, I believe they had the loss to Usyk. But then he went on to have a 3-fight winning streak. And I want to talk about that 3-fight winning streak. So the initial fight that they had was against Gerald Miller. So the important question is, who was Gerald Miller? For who was Gerald Miller at the time? Gerald Miller at the time was considered a relatively ferocious heavyweight fighter. He was heavily feared, and he would have a high output of punches. He would stalk you, and he would generally weigh opponents down. Now, considering that a lot of people were questioning, they weren't questioning Daniel Dubois' punch resistance, but they were questioning his heart. Considering they were questioning this, it's really important to acknowledge that, number one, in taking that fight was a hell of a test. But in overcoming the adversity in rounds, I think it was rounds 4 and 5, and then dominating from then on, and then scoring, it wasn't a knockout, it was a stoppage. That was a phenomenal performance. And Daniel Dubois had to do something different. Generally speaking, Daniel Dubois stalks his opponents. Check the Joe Joyce fight, or the majority of his other fights. But in this fight, he had to do something different. He had to move around the ring, he had to punch at the target, and he had to throw a lot of punches. And we got to give credit. We really have to give credit to Don Charles, because Don Charles guided the situation. And remember, when a fighter inherits a trainer, they're not just inheriting the trainer's advice. They're not just inheriting their philosophy. They're also typically inheriting their camp. So the trainer will pick the sparring partners. They will generally have a huge input in terms of the strategy and how to beat the opposition. So, of course, you have to give Daniel Dubois the ultimate credit, because he's the one who stepped in the ring and implemented the plan. But you also have to give Don Charles credit for being the one in the corner, for being you can also, what do they say, the term, the brain behind the brawn. And I say that respectively. So that was a very good performance. And then we had the fight against Filip Hrgović. And again, Filip Hrgović was an interesting one, because on one hand, he was seen as a good contender with lots of promise. But on the other hand, he had some terrible performances. Now, his performance against Zhilei Zhang was not a bad performance, because Zhilei Zhang was a good fighter. And this was evidence, the reference point was the 2 Joe Joyce fights. He was a hard puncher, a good counter puncher with good boxing intelligence. However, he had a terrible performance against McLean. And that's not to take anything away from McLean, because he performed really well. But Filip Hrgović performed really badly. And then there was another narrative. And that narrative was that these two had sparred together, and that Filip Hrgović had got the better of the sparring. So he was going up against a confident fighter anyway, a very confident fighter, but also a fighter that was more confident in beating him, because they had this history of sparring. And again, Don Charles was the person in the corner that guided Daniel Dubois to a victory. And let's remind ourselves that in that fight, in the beginning phases of that fight, Filip Hrgović took an enormous amount of punches. Filip Hrgović delivered an enormous amount of punches, and Daniel Dubois took an enormous amount of right hands. I mean, the way he was just taking the right hands after right hands after right hands was it was concerning. And you might question the defensive techniques. But as the fight progressed, or as the fight evolved, Daniel Dubois started showing some punch creativity. He was putting the head on the chest, throwing to the body, doing things that he'd typically not done before under other previous trainers. And he was roughing Filip Hrgović up. And then he got the stoppage. He stopped Filip Hrgović, so he was the first man to beat him and the first man to stop him. And again, it was a phenomenal performance. And those two performances gave him immense confidence. Of course they would have. And then he went up against Anthony Joshua. And Anthony Joshua again was the favorite, rightfully so, former two-time heavyweight champion. A lot of people are very disrespectful about Anthony Joshua, but he's accomplished a lot in a variety of ways, whether you talk about his publicity or what he's done in the ring, his boxing credentials, his credentials as a person. Anthony Joshua has made an amazing transition, and that should be saluted. It should be respected. But despite all of that, Daniel Dubois, the underdog, going into an environment that he'd never experienced before under the tutelage of Don Charles, went in and scored a phenomenal knockout. And that knockout was with a counter right hand. I believe it was a counter right hand. And I believe that that was something that Don Charles brought to the table. He, at the very least, sharpened that counter right hand, and he delivered that counter right hand under pressure. And previously, before Don Charles, Daniel Dubois struggled under pressure, under adversity, respectfully. So under Don Charles, he became heavyweight champion, a tremendous feat. And I think Don Charles would be very proud of what he'd done. Now, there is something I want to address, and there felt to me like there was a little bit of a disrespect from the Triple D, from Daniel Dubois' camp. And let me articulate that. Daniel Dubois never specifically, or I never specifically heard him give Don Charles the credit. It felt like he would refer to the team. Now, he may not have intentionally been disrespectful, but he would always single out his father, who obviously has played a significant positive role. And that's important to acknowledge what he's done for him. But at the same time, it's almost like he would say this name, but he wouldn't say that name. This name being the father, but that name being Don Charles. And I felt like there was a consensus within the boxing community that maybe Daniel Dubois, for some reason, just doesn't value or respect what Don Charles brings to the table, which is astounding from an outsider looking in. But what's equally, I don't know how to phrase this, but what's maybe equally astounding is that despite this, and despite the alleged contentions, Don Charles would go on the radio and he would go to the boxing media and he would defend Daniel Dubois to a T. He really would defend his fighter despite the alleged rumblings in the background. And I think it's important to acknowledge that this shows loyalty, and loyalty in boxing or loyalty in any game I think it's essential. And I think it's something that is perhaps lacking with a lot of people. So again, the fact that there was alleged rumblings, but despite this, Don Charles stepped to the boxing media, because he could have just ignored it. He stepped to the boxing media and he always defended his fighter with passion, with absolute passion. I think that says something about Don Charles. I really do. And I think he should be very proud of what he's done with Daniel Dubois. I think he should be very proud. Now, let's talk about and this is the thing. Not only was Don Charles training Daniel Dubois, he was almost in this quite complicated situation. And that complicated situation was the following. He was effectively taking a fighter that may have had some confidence issues and rebuilding a fighter, which in itself is a very difficult task. But then he was managing the alleged troubled relationship not between Daniel Dubois and his father, because they have a strong relationship, but he was managing what was alleged to be a troubled relationship that Daniel Dubois' father would have with other trainers. So he was managing the communication between him and the father, and also managing the communication between him and the boxing media. And again, I think that was quite, from the outside looking in, that looks like that's probably a hard, that's a hard walk, you know? There's a term called, it's a walk in the park. But in this park, there's snakes, there's poisonous spiders, there's lions, etc. I guess you get the point. And again, I think it's a credit to Don Charles that he was able to manage that relationship. And I also think that Don Charles can move forward in a positive light because he made a very positive impact on Daniel Dubois. So I guess the question is where does Daniel Dubois go from here, and where does Don Charles go from here? I think Don Charles has established himself as a really good trainer with great credentials. So I think a lot of people would want to work with him, not only for his boxing knowledge and input and philosophies, but also for his loyalty. Allegedly, Daniel Dubois has gone to Tony Sims. And I feel like Tony Sims has a lot of fighters at the moment. He has Conor Benn. He has, I always know him as the Spider, but he's a gentleman that gave Buatsi a very good fight. Craig Richards, I believe the name is. So he fought Bivol as well. He went 12 rounds with Bivol. And he also has Johnny Fisher. So he has a very live camp and a very live boxing environment. So this may not be a bad transition. Tony Sims is a respectable trainer. I guess the question is Tony Sims' boxing philosophy and strategies, are they going to elevate Daniel Dubois' fighting technique? Now, interestingly, I was watching a video of Tony Sims doing some training with Johnny Fisher, and he was talking about throwing the left hook, and he was actually explaining to dip and throw the left hook as opposed to throw the left hook short. And with fighters like Johnny Fisher and Daniel Dubois, you could argue that they need both of those things in their arsenal. Yes, there's a time to really roll with the left hook, but there's a time to throw the left hook short, particularly if you're trying to set up the straight right hand. So it'll be interesting to see how the boxing philosophy of Tony Sims gels with the philosophy or with the fighting style of Daniel Dubois. Is he going to look at Daniel Dubois and just allow him to be who he is and just add a few bits, or is he going to try to completely revamp his style? And there's an intrigue there. And like I said, from what I've seen from Tony Sims, he seems to be a creative, solution-focused person, and he has a gym that's full of energy, full of testosterone. So that can really help Daniel Dubois. But the question must be, or the intrigue is, what will the relationship be like between Daniel Dubois' father and Tony Sims? Because there is this narrative bias, and this is no disrespect, because maybe, at the end of the day, maybe the father just is making those hard decisions where he has a confirmation bias. His interest is his son, and if he feels that if something's not working, then he'll make that call. I guess the question there is, how independent is Daniel Dubois? Can Daniel Dubois make decisions independent of his father, or are they a package? And if they are a package, then there needs to be unison between him, the father, and the trainer. So I think this is going to be, there's going to be some interesting developments. And I hope that the boxing world shows Don Charles the respect he deserves. And I hope that Daniel Dubois and the father recognize that Don Charles was a significant positive influence that ultimately took Daniel Dubois to become a world champion. And that is an incredible achievement that anyone would be proud of.